Let's start this off with a deceptively tedious question. What is nihilism? Rather than addressing, we will divert for the sake of getting a better answer later. I will attempt to address that question a few times throughout the video, but I want to make a distinction here. In answering what is nihilism, we would not get much closer to answering our other, more relevant question. What is a nihilist? The nihilist is everything, where nihilism is nothing. If you think of nihilists as either some escape hatch to be apolitical but still seem cool, or some lazy pejorative for anyone left of Hillary Clinton who allegedly wants to destroy society, you'd be honestly kinda right in some cases. This is a loaded perception, but there are foundations that those who use the term pejoratively are building their perception on. A capital N self-defined nihilist movement didn't quite exist historically in the way we might think of, say, a socialist movement. Russia has a bit of a different historical setup, and we'll certainly be getting into that as our core case study. The pejorative nature of the term nihilist needs to be emphasized early because the pejorative, in some sense, is the unifier. Nihilist, in short, is a pejorative that is a negative exonym for radicals more often than it is a cogent identifier. So it is that the cultural impression of a movement coalesced, often around people who did, in fact, have political aims beyond just sheer discord or reaction against authority. To find a derisive use that has more heft than an offhand comment, look to Oscar Wilde's Vera or the Nihilists. The work tells a loose version of the story of Vera Sasulich, a real Russian political activist noteworthy for attempting to assassinate a man. She later became one of the most crucial figures for the spread of Marxist theory into Russia. In conflating her with nihilists in a fictional context, he gives us an example of this phenomena whereby her views become a soup of nothing and destructiveness. We will come back to Vera the person. We will not come back to Vera the play. A bit odd, perhaps, but today's sources will be more fiction that presents perceptions and debate around those perceptions than primary sources about the nihilists who lived. The Nihilists of Russia will be our case study, where we'll find the emergence of a book that swept the nation from village to villa and in turn sparked reactions and reactions to those reactions. Figures from Kropotkin to Dostoevsky to Tolstoy enter this dialogue. And so that's where we'll begin, with the cultural perception of the nihilists. Oh, and also, this is a video about Victoria 3 towards the end, but whatever. Now, I should note here an interesting detail that I do someday plan to do a whole video on as soon as I can figure out the perfect angle. It is this. I have read many Russian novels. In more than one instance, I picked up one copy of the book and bounced off, and another, and I liked it. What changed, of course, between those books was the translation. And it wasn't just an objective prose quality measure, as if such a thing exists. No, it was that the books functionally update through translation. So it is that a book written in 1860 might be stuffy for me, or flow quite well as per my readings of The Idiot. That invites a whole question of proximity to authentic experience and intent, and we'll be skipping that for now. But it is important to recognize that my copy of Fathers and Sons was a new-ish translation, and my copy of the subsequent book was an 1883 translation reprinted in 1982. Does this matter? Perhaps. The latter book has a whole bit that says the erotic scenes were restored in the 82 edition, and given what I've read, I have to wonder what else was historically omitted from it. With that all said, we turn to but are yet to open Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. Much of this section comes from the work of the introductory notes of my copy of Fathers and Sons, functionally an essay on the work by Rosamund Bartlett, who has done the work for situating the novel. Peter Carson provides the translation. I will not spoil the book. I want people to read these books on their own, but it will be necessary to tease out the cultural perception of these nihilists. And besides, the plot of the book is interesting, but it is, in a sense, a lesser part of the story than the cultural discussion it provokes and all the context that discussion requires. First, I must lay out some concepts and a timeline. Serfdom, liberalization, westernization, Slavophilism, radicals, and generational divide. We are situated at 1840 and looking forward to the 1860s. I can't spare a full digression on the history and practice of serfdom, but suffice it to say serfdom was a national conversation in Russia in the 1840s through to 1861 when it was abolished, and beyond, as the material consequences of emancipation came home to roost. It was a conversation the way slavery was in the United States at the same time, and abolition was for Great Britain almost a half-century prior. In this national conversation, we see the other elements, calls for liberalization, which means functionally westernizing, while fearing radicals who were pushing for more than just serfdom to end, and ultimately the generational divide of who believed in what. The European revolutions of 1848 are a background element of much of this, of course, and with any thinker of the period, you usually find a snippet, be it on Wikipedia or elsewhere, that mentions sympathies for or against 1848. Such will be the case with the authors we talk about. 1848 was about both liberalization and national identity, and for Russia there's a tension there. Liberalism was an import, but there's still the pressure to define the nation, and in that we have the Slavophiles who were often portrayed as their own kind of idealist fools, at least in the works of many of these writers. There is a generational line that gets drawn with the articulation of the so-called men of the 60s. In short, the men of the 60s were the new wave of progressives, though to call them that might be misleading for reasons that aren't intuitive. Less an issue of being actually regressive, which they were not, and more about the question of what progress even means. Here is a question now asked rhetorically that will return. Does a nihilist believe in progress? And here it is, I will fail for the first time to define a nihilist. Nihilism is literally nothingism. The word appears in Fathers and Sons in just such a way. The principal characters are two adherents to it, two nihilists. It is confusingly, yet correctly in a sense, defined as a negation of the present, its adherents as skeptics. To quote, "The nihilist is a man who bows down to no authority, who takes no single principle on trust, however much respect be attached to that principle." The book alludes to Feuerbach, but puts no principal theorist up as a conceptual father of capital N nihilism. They are materialists who reject the frivolity of sentimentalism and art. After all, a decent chemist's worth 20 times any poet. So we have our first definition, and it will be insufficient moving forward. Fathers and Sons manages to capture a cultural moment, and in portraying it, intensify it. The introduction to the book, at least my edition, makes clear how widely read this book was, saying it reached far-flung villages and was picked up by people who hadn't otherwise read a book in a decade. To begin, the book is about a young man, an aristocrat and university student, returning home to his aristocrat father and uncle and bringing with him his friend and quasi-mentor fellow student, I hate phrasing it this way, but it really is an effective term, his senpai, to meet the family. This second student, Bazarov, is the nihilist of the book. It is his views, his portrayal, that excites people for better and worse. He is the site of debate and dismissal. Thematically, the book is more about the sense of distancing and disconnect between generations. It's kind of that Simpsons meme of, now I don't even know what it is, someday it'll happen to you. And that's worth exploring on its own, but we'll hold off. People walked away from the book with a strong impression of the nihilist. This was somewhat unintended and came with some cultural consequences. And so begins the cultural conversation. To quote Kropotkin, Ivan Goncharov in Precipice, taking a real but unrepresentative individual of this class, made a caricature of nihilism. Turgenev was too good an artist and had himself conceived too much admiration for the type to let himself be drawn into caricature painting. But even his nihilist, Bazarov, did not satisfy us. We found him too harsh, especially in his relations with his old parents, and, above all, we reproached him for his seeming neglect of his duties as a citizen. The core thing to understand is that other cultural figures saw in Bazarov what they didn't want to see. To the aristocrats, he was a dangerous model. To the radicals, he was a weak caricature. Each group praised the book for the skewering it had for the other class, but derided the depiction of its own. Another quote, also found in Bartlett's work, by an American man, one Eugene Schuyler, who translated Fathers and Sons into English in 1867. A tempest was raised in Russia by its appearance. Each generation found the picture of the other very lifelike, but their own very badly drawn. Of course, the more the book was abused, the more it was read. Its success has been greater than that of any other Russian book. The cultural conversation that ensued did not play out to its fullest in essays and articles, but in other books, for reasons that are very important. Russia was a temperamental country at this time when it came to matters like liberalization and censorship. You'd be right to assume it was an autocratic empire that did not take kindly to dissent, but there were flickers of change here and there that gave writers the sense they could push things. One such writer was Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who wrote What Is to Be Done, a book functionally responding to fathers and sons and saying, "No, that's not what the nihilists are like, let me set the record straight." Chernyshevsky was a non-aristocrat professor, an established intellectual and essayist. He was a contributor to and chief editor for a permitted radical publication, Sovremennik, the Contemporary. He wrote What Is to Be Done in prison in 1862 and had it smuggled out, and it's only by chance, grave error, or some manner of sympathy that it evaded censors enough to see publication. Given his imprisonment, you can maybe see why books with couched meanings and deniable points of view were preferred to radical essays. They also had a better chance of mass appeal. Let me put the temperament of Russia in perspective using our writers. Dostoevsky was sent into exile and mock-executed in 1849 during the reign of Nicholas I for having been adjacent to an academic circle and reading a banned letter by Vissarion Belinsky to fellow writer Nikolai Gogol. Belinsky was a radical and contributor to Sovremennik who inspired Turgenev. Turgenev was arrested in 1852 over a eulogy of Nikolai Gogol. Culture was permissible, discussion less so. Then began the reign of Alexander II, who was considered a liberalizer, and writers got bold again. But by the middle of Alexander II's reign, there was a clamping down, and hence Chernyshevsky's arrest in 1862. Why was a eulogy dangerous? Was it even dangerous or a pretext? Were past publications future crimes? To be honest, I've buried the lead on Chernyshevsky's arrest here a bit. He was arrested for inciting the peasants. But it is this general atmosphere that strains things, as what is permitted flows and shifts, where there is innate distrust and even, in my view, preemptive self-censoring. It is in this environment that writing about and around the concept of the men of the 1860s, the egoists, the nihilists, the new people, proto-socialists, whatever you would call them, existed. The writers all knew each other, sometimes messily. Turgenev had been a contributor to Sovremennik, and when Fathers and Sons reached the publication stage, he did not publish with them. In fact, let's step back a little. Sovremennik had been a place of publication for Goncharov, Tolstoy, Turgenev, and many others. Its ideology, if it can be said to have one, was an aristocratic liberal perspective. But that changed with time and the approach of the 1860s. Those aforementioned writers left the magazine with the arrival of Chernyshevsky, a man of the 1860s and notably not of an aristocrat background. That is the underlying divide more than the generational one, I would wager. The liberalizing aristocrats like Goncharov, Tolstoy, and Turgenev against the raznochinцы, non-aristocrat intelligentsia like Chernyshevsky. Sovremennik was shuttered in 1862 because of its radicalizing, and because of Chernyshevsky's aforementioned imprisonment. In a sense, the split between Turgenev's liberal radicalism and Chernyshevsky's proto-socialist radicalism is in part what Fathers and Sons explores. Turgenev saw the end of serfdom as a great step forward, indeed the culmination of his politics. Chernyshevsky saw beyond that. When Turgenev talks about the difference between the men of the 1840s and the 1860s, he is presenting a divide he, for the most part, inhabited. He saw the older generation, who looked to aristocratic English liberalism as a template of society, as sort of falling behind when faced with the new era, who wanted even greater reform. He does not define the new generation's aims well, and it is not entirely his fault for failing to do so. For every well-read adherent of Feuerbach, for every rational egoist, for every young Hegelian, there were many idealists of ill-defined goals. In fact, goals were never so cohesive as to be plainly spelled out. To call the nihilists a movement is to imply a cohesion and a goal, and neither was very materialized. More on that later. His work does not take as clear a stance on this divide as people would have liked, more chronicling than it happened and lamenting that he himself had aged past the fore of progress. It is, in a sense, his work that helped define the popular understanding of what would become the men of the 1860s as well as the raznochinцы. He empathized with them as much as he was apart from them. They, however, saw his characterization as incomplete and unflattering. We then have the writers more famous to the Anglosphere for some reason or another who chime in with their own books. Ivan Goncharov, whose history working for the censor might give you a sense of his politics, writes The Precipice. Goncharov started writing before Fathers and Sons existed and finalized the work after, so it can't be properly called a reaction, but it speaks on the same cultural moment and sympathizes more with the old than the young. Dostoevsky has notes from the underground to specifically respond to Chernyshevsky. More interestingly, he's already been on the warpath against nihilism with a clearer opponent in the past, no less. His most famous novel, Crime and Punishment, was essentially an indictment of the works of one Dmitry Pisarev, a man who actually identified himself as a nihilist. In a letter, he pitches Crime and Punishment to a publisher as such. A young student of lower middle class origin who has been expelled from the university and who lives in dire poverty succumbs through thoughtlessness and lack of strong convictions to certain strange, incomplete ideas that are floating in the air and decides to get out of his misery once and for all. Later, he states, "Several recent occurrences have convinced me that there is nothing terribly unusual about my subject, namely the fact that my murderer is well educated and even a young man with praiseworthy inclinations. In brief, I am convinced that my subject will in a way explain what is happening today." He responds not only to Pisarev, but to the nihilists as a concept. But to detour, who was Pisarev and why might he be such a target for Dostoevsky? Pisarev was a nihilist radical of the 1860s who died under ambiguous circumstances, having written tracts of radical thought and financed the proliferation of such works. His beliefs are summed up by the quote, "What can be smashed must be smashed. Whatever withstands the blow is fit to survive. What flies into pieces is rubbish. In any case, strike out, right and left. No harm can come of it." He very much represents, in this, the kind of nihilist who wants to clear the ground. And to relate his works to the characters of Fathers and Sons, we have another quote from an essay on art. "Our lyric poets feed their destitution on the tiniest grains of thoughts and feelings that are the common possessions of all men, stupid and wise, cultured and uncultured, honest and dishonest." Amusingly, this so-called anti-art tract was published, but Chernyshevsky's name was omitted, and he was referred to as, quote, "the writer of what is to be done," because invoking his name would call in the censors. Perhaps this gives a sense of the role censorship played in all these conversations. It is my personal opinion that this essay points its venom more at the idea of a profit motive for art than at the value of culture itself, but that is, of course, tangential past a point. For our purposes, it corroborates a vision of Bazarov from Fathers and Sons, while also, from my perspective, being surrounded by misinterpretation that calls it anti-art. Indeed, Pisarev critiques Bazarov on the point of his besmirching arts merely because he cannot practice them himself. Can Pisarev resent art while admiring the work of someone like Chernyshevsky? Well, Chernyshevsky himself declares his work to be not art in the middle of the book itself more than once. So, art and nihilists have a confusing relationship. Tolstoy also has a book called in translation, What is to be Done, though the Russian title isn't quite the same. This work is a non-fiction assessment of Russia's social conditions, which breaks the trend of using fiction to have a conversation. In fact, while the reference is there, it comes out in 1886, which is 24 years after, so calling it a response as I've done here and seen elsewhere might frankly be incorrect. Tolstoy at this point was in his Christian anarchism era, so he writes things like, "Therefore, in our civilized world where the majority of people, amidst terrible privations, perform hated labors unnecessary to themselves, the greater number of men are in slavery based on the threat of being deprived of their existence. Of what, then, does this slavery consist? Wherein lies this power of threat?" In the same chapter, he uses the Bible, or specifically the Old Testament, to explore the way hunger is held over people to enslave them, hence the Christian angle of his Christian anarchism. He does not directly refer to nihilists, egoists, or seem dismissive of radicalism, merely materialism. He also includes this line, which, again, makes me feel like he agrees with Chernyshevsky more than not. "A young man changes his shirts daily. Who washes them? A woman. Whatever her state may be, very often old enough to be his mother or grandmother, often unwell. A young man, that he may be smart, provides himself with horses, and an old man, fit to be his father or grandfather, is set to training them, thus endangering his very life, and the young man rides on the horse when the danger is over. The whole of the well-to-do classes consists of a chain of such actions." I won't get trapped talking about Tolstoy longer, but you can see there is certainly a discussion of the issues going on. In Tolstoy, we see a disagreement, but in the others, we see contempt for the idealist and the perceived amoralism of what falls under the blanket of nihilists. But it is hardly compelling to defend the way things are, compared to a book that envisions what they could be. Fathers and Sons gets some of their attention, but of course, the book that opted to set the record straight, as it were, on the true aims of the young radicals, What is to be Done by Chernyshevsky, receives the brunt of the indirect critique. And with that all said, we can finally move to, well, actually, I don't very much need to dissect the plot of Fathers and Sons, do I? You see, the core narrative is not one in which nihilism is greatly explored. Sure, the word is used, nihilism, but the book isn't called Nihilists and Libs, it's called Fathers and Sons. One only walks away from the book with an understanding that nihilists do not respect authority and have only time for the perceivable, the senses, and none for the sentimental. The details of their ideology, so to speak, come out in conversations here and there, but the shape of the book might as well have had the young be merely pro-1848 radical liberals who wanted an end to kings, Jacobins of a sort. It would have had less punch and failed to capture the moment, but its core narrative could have played out in the same framing. Being a nihilist is not strictly necessary for the plot to continue. So what does the book think nihilists believe? A quote from the core nihilist of the text, Bazarov. Aristocracy, liberalism, progress, principles, goodness, what a lot of foreign words, and useless words. A Russian doesn't need them, even if they come free. There's something to the odd nationalist streak of bits of this work. In supposing the nihilist is both anti-Slavophile and anti-Western, one invites the obvious idea that he is merely anti-everything. There is instead an attempt to define a Russian path that Turgenev doesn't quite grasp in the concepts of what Chernyshevsky calls the new people. Later, on the same page, we see an exchange between an aristocrat and the two nihilist students. The aristocrat begins. You reject everything, or more precisely, you destroy everything, but one must also build. The nihilists reply, that is not our concern. First, one must clear the ground. The present condition of the people demands it. We must meet those demands. We don't have the right to satisfy personal egoism. And two things. 1. The nihilist is one who seeks to destroy the present, not build the future. This is much like the derogatory perception of anarchists as those who just want to tear things down, not build them up. 2. Egoism gets mentioned. Egoism is a recurring ideology in both this and What is to be Done. It bears some explanation. In a sentence, egoism is the belief in the pursuit of rational self-interest. This, immediately to some of you, will sound like some Ayn Rand or social Darwinist ideology. It can be taken that way, but so could the idea of freedom abstractly. But it is not expressly an ideology that must include survival of the fittest, absence of rules, or demanding selfishness. To make a distinction, there's nothing that strictly says that acting for the self means aggressively pursuing self-enrichment to the detriment of others. Then is it at least the same idea as selfishness given an ideological buttress? It can be in one's self-interest to act for the good of other people. What then? Is that the same thing as being selfless? No. You see how this is not so easy as an ideology of selfishness that stands against being good to other people. And in fact, this is a good time to define something adjacent to good. Morality. The moral. The theoreticians of the time, from Feuerbach to Stirner to Nietzsche, were all espousing one form or another of an anti-moralism. To a colloquial ear, if one understands moral to mean good, it would follow that anti-moral is evil, being allowed to murder and to steal and be unbound by morality. That is not the intent. Rather, it is to question what laws we have been handed by religion or cultural tradition, but it is not an omnipermissive questioning. Feuerbach was, after all, to bring back an idea alluded to earlier, neutral to the revolution of 1848. But it needs to be added that he was not an egoist, just a questioner of moralism. These ideas are interlinked and don't exclusively belong to nihilism or egoism or materialism. Ultimately, if we take Stirner to be the model, we have to assume that an egoist is being defined as prizing autonomy, and that includes respecting it in other people. To the egoists of Stirner's vein, morality should not bind our autonomy, and we should be guided by rational self-interest, but not impede the autonomy of others. Perhaps some of you can see how this affects certain dawnings of anarchist theory. Perhaps you can see how it implicitly allows for clearing the ground. The next book will use the term egoist more often and with greater clarity of intent. So then, are egoists nihilists? Well, our current definition of nihilists are those who reject authority in current structures, and the egoists do have a rejection of authority by way of prizing autonomy. But nothing about being an egoist fundamentally positions one in the latter element of the nihilist, as one who seeks to remove the present. And indeed, in theory, one could, as an egoist, see it as in their rational self-interest to submit to an authority or cooperate. It is not all pure individualism nor anti-structure. Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done does not use the word nihilist, but it does depict self-professed egoists. And that is where we will now turn. Again, I will not be spoiling it, but the book, more than depicting some kind of loose theme of society like intergenerational divide, is squarely fixed on three interwoven things: feminism, socialism, and love. I know it might sound like I'm overblowing it, given this is a book that was written in 1862 by a man in a Russian prison, but genuinely, so much of this book is squarely about the plight of women and a template for a rationalist equality of the sexes rooted in intellectual respect and mutual self-interest. Self-interest, in Chernyshevsky's eyes, the egoist precept, will naturally lead the educated towards cooperation and what is, in all but name, socialism. If he is an idealist, his ideal is that education will incline people to be good to each other, and in some sense that puts him at odds with Marx's understanding of class interests, but still on track for a socialist ideal. The book starts as a Russian parlor drama and ends with fourth wall breaks, dream sequences, and something I can only loosely call the specter of feminism haunting the world. What Is to Be Done is a book about a young woman who feels trapped in a miserable life by virtue of her sex and how she escapes and what she does after in pursuit of love and independence in a world that would casually deny her either. She meets the men of the 60s and becomes a woman of the 60s, so to speak. I cannot say much more. But let's diverge from the book to look again at the introduction for some situating. Note the edition I have has 3 introductions: the 1982 update, the 1960 preface, and the 1883 translation note. E.H. Carr's 1960 introduction says of Chernyshevsky, "A nihilist he was certainly not, except in the sense that every Russian radical and progressive believed automatically in the total destruction of the existing order of Russian society." 2 things here. 1, it is odd to assume every radical and progressive wanted for a total reordering of society, especially when we have the entire template of fathers and sons behind us. Liberals and progressives were, and indeed remain, the same thing in many cases. 2, we get a definition of a nihilist, of which Chernyshevsky was not, despite adhering to one of our core ideas displayed thus far. Chernyshevsky looked at the Bazarov of Fathers and Sons and said, "This is not what they, people like me, are like. Let me show you," and corroborated and expanded things. He articulates egoism, he emphasizes gender, he describes how rational self-interest can be innately communalistic in its individualism. No, indeed, if we qualify one as a nihilist by virtue of their destroying of the present order, then he is one. But if we disqualify one as a nihilist by virtue of their express presentation of a plan for the future, then he is not one. Thus, an incomplete second definition. A nihilist is one who seeks to undo the existing social order, morals, and structure, but evidently must not have a plan for the future ordering of society. To expand a little, Fathers and Sons posits an anti-sentimentalist picture of the nihilist who is more concerned with sensations. This leaves us with an odd and contradictory-ish picture, where pleasure and hedonism are not really discouraged, but certain pleasures are meaningless and trite, and thinking is a noble pursuit, but feeling something about poetry is foolish. This is a major break with Chernyshevsky's depiction. What Is to Be Done is a book about hardship and societal roles, but it is also full of leisure and joy and moments of rest. It appreciates levity in art and love. Is that a deviation from a hard materialist image of the nihilist, to let sentiment matter? Is that too archaic and romantic? A quote. "So this theory, which I do not see my way to accept, condemns men to a cold, pitiless, prosaic life? No, Vera Pavlovna. This theory is cold, but it teaches men to procure warmth. Matches are cold. The side of the box against which we scratch them is cold. Kindling is cold. But the fire which prepares warm nourishment for man and keeps him warm nonetheless springs from them. This theory is pitiless, but by following it men cease to be wretched objects of the compassions of the idle." And another. "There are joys purely ideal, even in hearts completely sunk in materialism, and this it is that proves the materialistic explanation of life unsatisfactory." The questions of art, of rationalism, of materialism against romanticism are less black and white as that presented by our earlier nihilists in Fathers and Sons. Taken together, the questions of art and culture and the generational divide intermingle. Where Fathers and Sons describes the men of the 1840s as romanticists, What Is to Be Done clarifies the nuance of the type that has appeared recently, the rational egoists, the nihilists. We are thus led towards this. Egoism is about knowing oneself, and in some cases reconciling that you cannot ever truly know another person. In that lens, art becomes even more meaningful and more meaningless. It also draws that line against the romantic, which above all else wishes to express the self so as to be perfectly known, or in some cases known before one has spoken. Egoism counters. If we presume we can never know each other, then what can art communicate? Indeed, instead of feelings and sentiment, it has a duty to depict the real. On another note of cultural discussion, the nihilists of What Is to Be Done make mention of nations and nationhood and nationalism sparingly, often in giving credit to German thinkers. There is not much to be said about Slavophiles or the tension of Westernization versus Slavophilism, though Chernyshevsky's quoting of Western figures in poetry does suggest a Western leaning for himself. I don't think internationalism is pointedly articulated in this work, but there is also not quite a Russian chauvinism, for lack of a better term. By contrast, Fathers and Sons seems to position the nihilists as sort of Russian nationalists, while also obviously indebted to the German thinkers, but finding Slavophiles silly and the Western liberal aristocrats to be antagonistic. It paints them into an odd corner, though I don't think that's an inconsistency of portrayal on Turgenev's part so much as a product of unclear ideology. That's the core of comparisons. Chernyshevsky is an egoist and a rationalist and a radical, but he does not lack an ideal of the world, nor does he dismiss contained change. His characters do not upend society, they make a new society for themselves, among themselves. Within the book, characters have their speech moments, their intellectual jousts, and their declarations of belief. This book does not kill God. It does not even deign to speak much of religion in the negative, so much as of the rational and material in the positive. The egoism of Chernyshevsky's egoists, nihilists, men of the 60s is ultimately what we might ironically call altruistic. To quote a moment, "What right have you to demand of me what is painful to me? Stop this romantic nonsense. Society must acquire new ideas, it is true. Also true that he who has acquired them should aid others. But until this radical change has taken place, you have no right to meddle in the destiny of another." And another. "You know well of what they say of such people as we are, that to them nothing is sacred. Hence we are capable of all sorts of violence and meanness." The former is an articulation of what the characters believe. What Chernyshevsky believes guides many of the alleged nihilists, and the latter is a character demonstrating his awareness of the anti-moral caricature cast onto the new people by society. It is in moments like these that Chernyshevsky is in dialogue with the cultural specter of Bazarov, which leads us to Chernyshevsky's own larger-than-life weird guy who made a lasting cultural impact. I can't help slightly spoiling this guy's place in the work, but I do implore you, if the book sounds interesting so far, you'll lose a tiny bit of the magic via this section. It's very funny to read the pages about him because the author himself is like, "Oh, so you think you understand why I've added him? Go ahead, guess. Guess, my smart little reader, enlighten me to why I have done this." The novel halts to have a whole explanation in second person talking to the reader about the guy. So who is he? In short, he, RAKHMETOV, is a platonic ideal of a true egoist revolutionary, an ubermensch weirdo who exists as sort of a Mary Sue to provide a measure for how ordinary and non-heroic the actual protagonists of the novel are. He stops by to be like, "I am glorious and amazing. I live off a diet of the cheapest bread on earth and meat, so I may be efficient but also jacked as fuck, stoic, and live in the service of revolution. Farewell." Just so that you, perceptive reader, will go, "Ah, I see. Vera and Lopukov and Kirsanov are not caricatures or abnormal. They do not go so far as RAKHMETOV." And in turn, he has a Wikipedia page because of course he does, and the wiki page for Chernyshevsky wrongly calls him the hero of the novel, and allegedly, his cultural impact was a bunch of readers going, "Whoa, that's the coolest guy in the world. I want to be just like him and become a revolutionary." And allegedly, that's why Lenin started working out. It's all very funny because he's like kind of a cartoon character. And also, Lenin keeps being mentioned, be it in wikis or the back of the books as being inspired by the book, and of course he was, given he wrote a pamphlet with its same name. But also, it's amusing to see him be linked to Rakhmetov, but no one drawing the line between his historically noted supreme wife guy behavior and this novel, which is more about women's rights and place in the world than anything else. Speaking of, I will not linger long on the approach of the book to the relation between men and women to society, as it is somewhat outside the scope and deserves maybe its own dissection. However, it is important to note how much equality between the sexes is pressed on as a point for the novel, a principle of the new people, of the rational and enlightened man. It's almost like this book exists so that when someone inevitably reads of the egoists and goes, okay, so no authority and yay rational self-interest and no religious or cultural chains of morality, so how about women? And historical thinkers go, oh, we forgot to talk about women, huh? Chernyshevsky can be like, you did, I didn't. An early segment of the book muses on the thoughts of a suitor of the protagonist, Vera Pavlovna, and then digresses into the author's perspective fully. And he pondered over this question. Shall I marry her? As before he pondered over the other, shall I make her my mistress? That is the common trait by which Storeshnikov presented very adequately 9/10 of his fellow citizens of the world. Storeshnikov had become accustomed to dream of the possession of Vera. Followed with, oh, human degradation, depravity, to possess. Who dares possess a human being? One may possess a pair of slippers, a dressing gown, but what am I talking about? Each of us, men, possesses some of you, our sisters. You are our servants. There are, I know, some women who subjugate some men, but what of that? Many valets rule their masters, but that does not prevent valets from being valets. If you believe in individual freedom maximizing and removing the chains of old moralities, then equality of the sexes is nigh inevitable. What logic would an egoist who is against impeding others have to keep women down? When people accuse Marx, and in turn Marxists, of ignoring the women question, they're quite right to do so. It's just funny that there was a guy who wrote a book that could have basically been called On the Women Question and also Socialism and maybe Polyamory. And on that note, there is one woman question I'd like to address. I've seen it said, in comments, discussions, and on the wiki, that Ayn Rand was inspired by this book. Is that the case? And if so, does that reflect on the book? As someone who rather famously refused to attribute her insights to any inspiration save Aristotle, I don't find this unbelievable, but it's often said with a note of derision, and in turn has kind of colored, I think, people's perceptions of the book, if they even have them. And in turn reinforces her connection to the idea of what an egoist is. After all, if this book is about egoists and the egoists are about individualism and she's hyper-individualist, then why not assume a connection? Well, given where all this goes and how dedicated the book is to the idea that rational self-interest is not some kind of social Darwinist hellscape or excuse to be selfish, I don't think we can blame this book for Ayn Rand. This is a good time to draw a distinction between selfishness and the individual, and rather helpfully, the book does this for us by fourth wall breaking in order to discuss the difference between two characters. Lopukov, an egoist doctor, and Maria Alexeyevna, a manipulative and abusive pawnbroker. I realize how greatly Lopukov is compromised in the eyes of the enlightened public by Maria Alexeyevna's sympathy for his way of thinking. But I conceal nothing. In fact, I take it upon myself to explain that he really deserved Maria Alexeyevna's favor. The resemblance in their actions is so great that enlightened novelists holding noble ideas, journalists, and other public teachers have long since proclaimed that individuals like Lopukov are in no wise distinguishable from individuals like Maria Alexeyevna. The difference between them is in their understanding of self-interest as a concept, where the selfish one believes it to mean enrichment of the self, and the egoist believes it to mean that others must be allowed to enrich themselves, and in doing so, will bring the better future. And an important part here is that Chernyshevsky shies away from some ontological selfishness and innate badness within people. To condemn Maria Alexeyevna would confound his whole belief in educating people away from selfishness. And in the end, where does that lead us? What does Chernyshevsky believe in? Well, according to the final dream sequence of our protagonist, Vera, which was censored from the translations for quite some time, Chernyshevsky had a vision of a rationally guided world whereupon egoists would naturally conclude it was in their self-interest to pursue gender equality and communal existence. The conversation was started by fathers and sons with an imagined nihilist created by someone nominally sympathetic to, but not an adherent of, their cause. Left the permanent impression of Bazarov upon the cultural fabric. Chernyshevsky, a man who Bazarov represented, in turn left his own imprint in an effort to iron out some mistakes, hoping it would, of course, be Vera. Unfortunately for him, he made his cartoon strongman too cool and it inspired the Russian Revolution. So, you know. More seriously, Chernyshevsky's Vera Pavlovna stares down the part of Bazarov that proclaims that there is no plan, no future, no goal besides clearing the ground, and offers an obvious path, no less full of negations of the past, but with a destination in mind. And the path she proves is one that can be lived, in the moment, in spite of the present and its ties to the past, until it becomes the future. And so we dispense with novels and move to history. I've talked around and intermingled history into discussing the novels. It can't be helped, but there are, of course, parts of the history not cleanly reflected in novels. So I frame this section beginning with one man, already mentioned, and ending with one woman, already mentioned. Vissarion Belinsky was not only a young radical, he was a thread tying together the nascent radical movement itself. His letter got Dostoevsky imprisoned, led to the arrest of the Petrushevsky circle of intellectuals who also counted Chernyshevsky as a member. He was arrested on the day before he died of consumption, which had been killing him for a long while. Many of the figures in the movement cite him as an inspiration, and he died before there could be any falling out. Belinsky died young as a revolutionary figure who was of the 1840s, so he became a bit of a symbol to all parties to be invoked. Would our dear friend and inspiration Belinsky have agreed to revolutionary actions? In the abstract? In specific to this instance? In terror? In waiting for the right conditions? Questions like this circled the discussions of Turgenev, Chernyshevsky, and famously Alexander Herzen, who breaks from Chernyshevsky's Men of the 1860s over such questions in an article for The Bell titled, "Very Dangerous." To quote from it is difficult, as the jabs are coded attacks, but to the Sovremeniak writers like Chernyshevsky, they would have known it was feuding with them as much as it distanced from certain types of aristocrats. I will link it for the curious. Generational divides are not clean and absolute, even if they haunt this whole discussion. In the actual history of events, there are always people who are before their time, and there are always ways to describe a radical as not radical enough. So it is that we have a figure like Belinsky at the beginning, before the men of the 1860s, who was more radical than his 1840s generation. So it also is that we have someone like Alexander Herzen who breaks with Chernyshevsky on the question of radical aims while not sliding into full reaction as Dostoevsky did. Herzen is, all the same, functionally left behind, despite having built a career around anti-clerical and anti-aristocratic sentiment, despite having seen serfdom as an evil all along. And of course, Chernyshevsky proves a point of being ahead of one's time, what with the feminism. There was often still more common ground between them all than not. The men of the 1840s were often the inspiration for the men of the 1860s, after all. Another poor attempt to define a nihilist. A nihilist is merely a radical active in the post-serfdom question era who sought to go further in political aims but did not back away from revolutionary tactics. Herzen is not a nihilist. Chernyshevsky is, and perhaps idealistically, Belinsky would have been. This is the definition by way of going too far. An essay by Christian Petrov titled "Strike Out Right and Left: A Conceptual Historical Analysis of 1860s Russian Nihilism and Its Notions of Negation" gets at the heart of who the historical nihilists were. I wish I'd found it sooner, but am also glad I found it when I did, after having time to stew in my own thoughts on the matters in question. I will note that this essay does have spoilers in it if you want to read it, but it's interesting. Let it give us another attempt at definition. The very foundation of Russian nihilism seems to be the negation of the supposedly irrational, false, and unjust. For Herzen, that nothing which so far has deceived us as something. In Pisarov's words, formulated as any deformation that weighs on the earth and darkens the sky, with the aim of emancipating the individual from the constraints of society, family, and religion. Russian nihilism is thus centered on the negation of the unjust and irrational, leaving us an unclear line between negating the irrational and promoting the rational, in tearing down the unjust and forming the just. It presumes negation is not building, even when building is a means of negation. I see no other way to understand the act of, say, education. One interesting framing I've gotten from this essay is the idea of anti-nihilism as a briefly existing literary genre. It is not, in fact, pro-moral, a positive idea. It is a negative, negating nihilism, negating negation, which inspired people like Dostoevsky. When we read his work today, it is very often without that context. And of course, Petrov is quite right to say, as I've hopefully demonstrated, that the anti-nihilists were the ones defining the nihilists, that Bazarov is not a self-depiction, even if he is still the archetype. In Petrov's view, the negation of the nihilists is not actually tied to the apparatus of the state and culture that they wish to undo, but in response to the idealism of the generation prior. The term nihilist, I suggest, in its significant association with the 1860ers, should, in this context, be understood in relation to the idealist of the 1840-era generation. Those 1860er nihilists share their identity, however, not only with having challenged and succeeded previous ideologies, but through shared dependence on, selective inclusion of, and radicalized continuity with extant ideology. With everything said, I don't agree entirely with the conclusion of the second section of this essay. I do think it's fair to say that the Russian nihilists inhabit a contradictory space, but a character, for example, bemoaning love is trite and falling in love later isn't a moral failing or a contradiction, it's just that people hold ideals they can't always meet. More than that, I don't know that it's fair to say What Is to Be Done's protagonists are too emotional and altruistic to mesh with the Bazarovs or the RAKHMETOVs of the movement. I think there's not poles, there's a gradient of approaches. I do, however, agree with the paper's aim, which it accomplishes, of dragging the understanding of nihilism away from functionally being an anti-theist worship of negation itself. The paper does, as I'm intending to do here, the work of laying out the conversation in culture. It notes and avoids believing the anti-nihilists to be accurate chroniclers of what nihilists believed. The final conclusion comparison to movements that send secular missionaries to the countryside, so to speak, is interesting, but I'm not sure that there's much to be gained comparing the fanaticism of a secularist radical umbrella made up by people who feared societal change to terrorist actions of contemporary fundamentalists. I don't know, it's certainly an ending one could write for a paper. Ultimately, the irony is that the nihilists are defined by negation, not as their own beliefs, but what they are not, by who they are not, by anti-nihilists who focus on the anti, on the immorality, on the atheism, on the eschewing of principles. But let's move from the intellectuals to the, I suppose I'll call them activists. To get too deep into the narodniks and peasantry and populism would derail us and mean adding in like several more important guys, but there is, of course, a significant overlap between the intellectuals who wanted to prime the peasantry for revolution and revolutionary actors. And in turn, there is much shared between revolutionary actors and those whose writing inspired them, like Herzen and Chernyshevsky. Now, who are the narodniks? What do they believe? Narodnik comes from narod, meaning people. They're the peopleists, populists, if you will. In specific, they believe the peasant class to be the one with revolutionary potential. I wonder if that's at odds with any popular form of socialism that has yet to hit Russia at the time. They were not a singular organization, but a conceptual faction, an ideology of sorts. There were several revolutionary groups that represented them, and two key ones being first, Land and Liberty, which formed in 1861 and later reformed in 1876, and second, Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will, in 1879. Each formation or group is more active than the last. Let me offer a timeline of events because this stuff gets messy fast and time is important. The key plot points are the 1866 assassination attempt, an 1869 murder, an 1878 assassination attempt, the 1878 mass trials, and an 1881 assassination. In 1866, there was an assassination attempt on the Tsar, Alexander II, by one Dmitry Karakozov. Allegedly, and I have my doubts, despite Wikipedia citation, Alexander asked him during the attempt, "What do you want?" And he replied, "Nothing. Nothing." Per a book I do not have access to that was actually about Vera Zasulich more than Karakozov. Karakozov was not involved with any of the groups mentioned thus far, but his actions inspired them just as much as they became a point of severe derision for the anti-nihilists. But was he a nihilist? The cool quote, if true, would be a poignant way to say, yes he was, he said the word nothing. His actions thus become part of the prelude for the groups in their own actions. But it then has to be asked, are these groups even nihilists? Are they nihilists in the self-defining sense? Much of their revolutionary action consisted of the classic send the smart guys to the countryside and try and mass educate the peasantry, and that, irrespective of efficacy, does imply an ideology and goes beyond just clearing the ground, but it doesn't contradict the idea of education being a liberator. It's not so clean as that, and of course the intelligentsia did include egoist preachers, for lack of a better term. Exonymically, they were nihilist agitators, going out to the peasantry and trying to spark revolution, and some of them did overlap with the urban academics who wore dark glasses, the figures whose radical zeal led to the student murders. Oh, we should talk about that. Our middle figure, Sergei Nechayev. Nechayev was the boots-on-the-ground side of the revolutionary clique, the person the intellectuals knew who would actually do the doing when they wouldn't. He was a nihilist, and in some form, a communist. Remember, though, that communism and Marxism are far less synonymous at this time, and that many of the communists of this era were inspired by loose materialism mixing with utopianism and a dash of young Hegelianism. The revolutionary student cell he led went on to murder a perceived, and I do mean perceived as an unsubstantiated, traitor Ivan Ivanov, cool name no notes, in 1869. This murder was a shock to society, a sign of depravity, and one which eventually caught up to Nechayev despite his escape from the country. After Nechayev's escape to Switzerland, Alexander Herzen, who I earlier mentioned as the liberal radical left behind by time, died. In death, he donated personal wealth towards funding Nechayev's revolutionary actions. Said actions were mixed to poor in result. Among them was functionally blackmailing the other radicals, Russian or otherwise, including Marx. Nechayev was arrested and extradited in 1872. In 1878, the two mass trials of the era occurred, the trial of the 193 in St. Petersburg and the related trial of the 50 in Moscow, targeting largely women. This pushed the movements away from agitation and into outright acts of terror, somewhat following the lead of Nechayev, but in turn, they also moved past the need for him. Narodnaya Volya put its energy towards planning assassinations and no longer had time to consider freeing a captured and complicated comrade. In 1881, the Narodniks assassinated Alexander II. Nechayev died in prison in 1882. He fanned the flames, often directly into the path of his fellow revolutionaries. The assassination of Alexander II in 1881 was perhaps the only Narodnik success politically, one that also doomed the movement entirely. It is perhaps fairly intuitive that peasants lacking class consciousness would not care about the backsliding the Tsar had done around student rights, and may, perhaps, maybe, kind of, sort of, have remembered him more as the man who emancipated the serfs. So killing him did not encourage revolution as hoped, nor indebt the peasants to the movement. Our final character, also our first. Vera Zasulich was a Russian aristocrat turned revolutionary. She was inspired by works like Chernyshevsky's and eventually joined Nechayev's group. Later, at his first exile, he allegedly declared love for her, was rebuffed, and moved on. He then got her a multi-year prison sentence by intentionally sending a bunch of people agitation propaganda in what I can only describe as a stupid accelerationist tactic to get them imprisoned and thus radicalized. Then again, given she did very much go on to try and kill the governor of St. Petersburg, I suppose it at least didn't hurt her radicalism, but given everything, it seems like she was already committed to the cause without all that. It is during her imprisonment that the Ivanov student murder occurs. She is exiled, lives in poverty, and joins a Narodnik group. In 1878, the day after the trial of the 193, Zasulich attempted to assassinate the governor of St. Petersburg. Was she a nihilist then? Perhaps. It was a revolutionary action in service of a post-1860 movement. She was acquitted, against expectation, for an act she very much did, which reflects public sentiment. After fleeing, she eventually situated herself into the ideology of Marxism. In 1881, she wrote to Marx, the same year of the assassination of the Tsar. In 1883, she was instrumental in the formation of the Emancipation of Labor group, and worked on translation and dissemination of Marx's work in Russia. Is she a nihilist anymore? No. By 1883, the wind has turned. Her life continues and her story continues, but the last flutter of what one might call nihilism is gone. Political violence in Russia ratchets up significantly after this point, but the cultural presence of the nihilists as a distinct entity has faded, not least because Marxist political organizations articulate themselves and become the new antagonist for the state. Nihilism, if it ever had anything we can call a vision of the future, is replaced by a more articulated thought that itself has to struggle to win out. And in turn, the nihilists are gone. I want to start this segment with a strong question. Are the nihilists getting the Luddite treatment? Luddites in the game are anti-industry technophobes. In history, that's an interpretation of their movement. It's the pejorative and dismissive one that haunts their image. You can see where I'm going here. The Luddites were, in reality, not technophobes afraid of progress, but responding to the threat of their livelihoods being replaced and the harm inherent to a change in their material conditions. If they feared anything, it was the inarticulated consequences of industrialization. Are the nihilists defined by their negative caricature? Honestly, not really. The default content in-game centers fathers and sons and elements from it and the Russian historical moment, while abstracting it to be generalized events. I get the references. Does it go deep into who the nihilists really were? Is there even space to? Frankly, they might get some more content with State and Revolution, which I'd appreciate. They could even steal from my mod and I might not care. What defines the nihilists in-game? The journal for their appearance is centered in vanilla on two bounds, having discovered realism while having not discovered socialism or anarchism. Functionally, this implies they are a rudderless middle step of an ideology, revolution without aims, clearing the ground. There is a bit of a question of what anarchism in turn means to the game. It is not the typical caricature of lawless nothingness. It couldn't be that and even be presentable in-game. As we'll touch on again, a non-state isn't really an option to represent. This means that anarchists would appear with an ideology before the nihilists even hit the scene, much less before they quit it. But again, researching anarchism or socialism functionally fizzles the nihilist movement. We are forced to consider timelines and relations. The idea of when texts happen is difficult to really divine, as tech trees always are for history games, and it has a potentially significant impact here. That said, I don't dislike the fizzle. I think it fits if your narrative of nihilists is that they're somewhat directionless or merely disunified, save the impulse towards change itself. The question becomes if that's what one wants to portray them as, and if that's a disservice to the actual history. There is also a structural limitation to depicting the nihilists. Victoria 3 is a game built for a certain purpose with a certain lens, so of course there will be limits on everything to do with niche political movements. If we take nihilists to have a belief against the concept of a progress narrative, then the game, which fundamentally believes in progress and makes it gameplay, cannot represent them. If we take the idea of a nihilist government to be patently absurd in the face of negation, that the nihilists have no program beyond clearing the ground, then Victoria 3 cannot represent a nihilist victory. If we take a vanilla detail, Stirner's Union of Egoists, merely a nihilist dynamic tag for Germany, and look at what such a union actually entails, it would be impossible to translate to something playable. Yes, we've had the discussion on this channel many a time about who the player is and how the player is not the state, but the player needs the state or something very much like it to structurally exist for most any mechanics to be functional or representable. So then, would this nihilist-aligned vision of the future be viable in Victoria 3? Indeed, questions like this inspired my mod. I won't say I've gone as far as to resolve them all, but I was sort of haunted by the flippant ease of becoming and losing a nihilist government, something that feels like it very much ought to be a massive societal change, potentially more so than a communist revolution, given nihilism forces the unfamiliar to the fore. In turn, I've made my mod with the present understanding that unless we want to get really into when a state simply doesn't exist, the reality of the setting will be that the nihilists, once they are the government, can make some concessions about what a state can do for them and its value, given they're not exactly anarchists either and are given to other hypocrisies and concessions by design. And alongside that, nihilism is inextricably linked to women's liberation in most of its extant forms. Part of this, of course, is modeled on Chernyshevsky's work and part on the presence of women in historical radical movements that were exonymically declared nihilist. It seems quite logical to me that if a man wrote a book in 1862 and that book became a hit and also envisioned a world of women's liberation, that perhaps his ideology does not have to wait for whatever the discovery of feminism represents in-game. Like many parts of the game, I presume the default of the society tree is tuned around the Western industrialized experience. This needs some undoing in this case. With beelining and, of course, recognizing that there are many factors to enhancing the rate of tech acquisition, it would take Russia from game start setup 60 years to get to feminism. Also, this prompts a hitherto unsaid sentence. Even for a nation that understands egalitarianism, human rights stand in the way of feminism. A lot of the mod ultimately is unrealistic, but it springs from what I can only hope feel like natural conclusions of the concepts and history of nihilism. My intent is to add some flavor to the biggest players, but ultimately Russia and Germany are the core ones. Everything else will be the imagined what-if stuff, be that occasional buttons to click or merely in the player's head. I can't trawl the hypothetical of what Andean Federation nihilist technocracy would really look like culturally. the flavor in many cases must remain abstract. I am building on the vanilla experience. The vanilla experience is already ahead of the curve for depictions of the era and of nihilism, given how overlooked the cultural moment tends to be in the greater story of revolutions. More than anything, I want to spark curiosity in the cultural moment that only tends to reach us from the famous anti-nihilist works, enough so that we may not recognize they even have an ideology in mind, nor one in their crosshairs. By now the point is well tread. Nihilist means nothing, and it means nothing. It is a pejorative from people who do not understand the aims of some kind of revolutionary action or way of living. Nihilism is cast as a philosophy of entropy. It is a placeholder for radicalism as much as it can be one for an absence of cohesive purpose. At times it feels as though it only nebulously exists, is only a title from the outside, cast by historical figures unto the contemporaries they disdained, or by us, in the present, unto a past we've ordered to be more cohesive than it ever was. Many identified with the concepts that those outside the circle would identify with nihilists, and then people identified with the caricatures, and it became real in multiple ways at once. An egoist is a nihilist. A radical with revolutionary tactics is a nihilist. A materialist is a nihilist. The communists, too, were nihilists. Thus far, I've said that nihilists are the ones fixated on the now and ending the present, indifferent to what comes of the future, but that definition has more counterexamples than examples. The men of the 1860s, the women of the 1860s, they may not have had shared visions, but they did envision the after. Is that a progress narrative or not? Was clearing the ground a caricature statement? It rings true in some rhetoric and false in others, feels like progress in some definition and like too hard a break to assign continuity in others. A final word on the battle sheathed in books between Turgenev and Chernyshevsky. The works ultimately tell two kinds of timeless stories. Fathers and Sons is the story of generational divide and will likely be told again and again in different forms for a very long time. What is to be done imagines a world where that story no longer needs to be told. It is utopian in more sense than one, but it also asks us not to be idle till the day comes, but to build the future in the present. Are either of these works nihilist? Do either of them represent nihilism as a destructive end? Fathers and Sons depicts the idea partly, but the book is not pro-radical. What is to be done rejects it in a sense, but does think the arrangement of society must change. But it doesn't see the protagonist's efforts as futile, and indeed chides her for almost letting slip her model of society in miniature due to personal grief. It is here that I will mention there are contemporary nihilists, so to speak. There is contemporary discourse about the concept of negation, of action in the now. I will link a work on the subject with healthy forewarning that it is a heavy read. But perhaps it will put in perspective how someone could even think of only the now, only of, as Bazarov says, clearing the ground. Oh, and video games, right, the arguable point of all this. Nihilism could have merely been rolled into other things, chiefly the radical ideology of Victoria III, which stands for those who embraced revolutionary tactics while aspiring towards a liberal future. It could also be represented by communists and utopians. A utopian, after all, attempted to kill the Tsar in 1866. And while I've tried to give more nuance to what nihilists mean in game, I have to commend their presence in the first place, given they're an often forgotten part of history, left to be less than a footnote to the Narodniks, themselves a footnote to the 1890s, which is a footnote to the Russian Revolution. Generations of radical thought shifting in form led to the revolution as we got it, and depicting those parts discreetly is both in the service of the game's flavor and in the service of enlightening people to history as they may not have heard it. The mod I've made is hyperbolic, more than a grounded alternate history. My point in making it was partly, of course, fun. I've become my own antagonist, game first, history second. The purpose is less to give people flavor in a purely historical sense than to try and make a cohesive imagining of if nihilist culture, so to speak, had won. I wanted to make clear through play that the historical nihilists were something beyond just radical liberalism, but not yet socialists as we think of them, or were individualists as we forget them to be. Half the point of the mod is malleability and indecision, fighting with the question of purpose and if clearing the ground is a perpetual work to be done, and what it would require. I wanted to represent the zeal, the absurd, the real, and the remarkable, and I wanted to take the nihilists at their word since we so often choose to take the anti-nihilists at theirs in defining them. And if that doesn't come out in the finished product, at the very least I can say that I hope you've come away from all this having learned nothing. Hi, thanks for watching this video that was supposed to be a glorified showcase for a particular historical element of a video game and somehow evolved into me making an entire mod, then neglecting to showcase the mod and instead reading several books, essays, and articles on the Russian nihilist movement. Hopefully that was interesting for you and worth the wait. I'll link the mod and eventually there will be a trailer of sorts or presentation about it. Thank you to Najrants for giving me a bit of guidance in conversation on this one. They've got an interesting channel if you want to look at some of the more specific minutiae of Soviet history, the kind of niched channel where the niche really pays off. And thank you to everyone who makes this possible, from viewers to patrons, which are kind of like the revolutionary vanguard of viewers, or something, whatever. This time, thanks to Alessandro Andrioni, Jen Orsa, Cesare Mikua, Clever Riley 9, Dan C, Galactic Beyond, Gilded Dragon, Hornlet, Isaac of Lyria, Jay Kasky, Laird Olive, Lissing FMA, Mark Soto, Mihrab, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitapir, Narodnik Soviet, Riley Long, Sipa Turnipsy, Third Zeno, Turtle D Magnum, Vichure, and Yura Sikorsky. Next time is about something else. Bye.